In the quiet heart of Pike County, a mystery lingered like a shadow no one could escape. Two teenage sisters walked home one autumn night in 1974 and vanished without a trace. For decades, the town paved new roads, built new homes, and tried to move on. But buried beneath the shifting ground was a truth that refused to stay hidden. 45 years later, a single unexpected discovery inside an abandoned mine would crack open a case everyone thought was lost to time. This is the story of how silence was broken, secrets were unearthed, and justice finally caught up with the past. Time moved forward, but the pain in Pike County never truly faded. In the years following the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez, the town went through countless changes. Old coal mines that once echoed with the sounds of workers were sealed shut, rusted fences were torn down, abandoned buildings were demolished, and empty fields were slowly covered with fresh layers of pavement. Roads were widened, new businesses opened, and families came and went. To anyone passing through, Pike County looked like a place that had grown, healed, and moved on. But beneath that surface, one wound never closed. The mystery of what happened to the Martinez twins hung over the town like a heavy cloud that refused to drift away. It wasn't just another unsolved case. It became a part of Pike County's identity. Everyone who lived there knew the story. Parents warned their children not to wander too far. Teenagers whispered the tale on quiet nights. And for the Martinez family, every single change in the town felt like a piece of the truth was being buried deeper. Former Deputy Calvin Brooks never forgot the night the girls went missing. Even decades later, he could recall every detail of the search, how the community gathered with flashlights and lanterns, combing through fields, woods, and abandoned buildings. He remembered the faces of the volunteers, tired and worried, refusing to give up hope. But as the years went on, Calvin's frustration grew. Each new construction project meant another patch of land was disturbed, another old structure was torn down, and possibly another clue was lost forever. Every time they sealed up a mine or knocked down an old house, Calvin once said, "I thought to myself, what if the answer was in there? What if we sick are covering up the very thing we need to find?" The town's progress came at a quiet cost. Important sites from the original investigation slowly disappeared. Paths that once led search parties to promising areas became roads. Vacant lots, where evidence might have been buried, turned into parking spaces. For those who still cared about the case, it felt like the town was unknowingly erasing its own history. Yet, the Martinez family held on to hope. Robert and Maria Martinez, the twins' parents, kept their daughter's room almost exactly as it had been. The wallpaper, the books on the shelves, the framed school photos all remained untouched. They never moved away. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, they placed fresh flowers at the entrance of the old Blackwood mine, a symbolic gesture of remembrance and stubborn hope. Every 5 years, the case found its way back into the headlines. Local newspapers would reprint old photographs of the smiling twins in their diner uniforms. News stations would revisit interviews with aging officers, retired detectives, and family members. Each wave of media attention brought in new tips, some from people who claimed they had overheard something years ago, others from those who were convinced they had seen the girls after their disappearance. But most of those tips led nowhere. Promising leads would fizzle out. Witnesses would contradict each other. Memories faded, and slowly the investigation would return to silence, waiting for the next cycle to begin. For new generations growing up in Pike County, the Martinez case became more than a tragedy. It became a story passed down like folklore. Some kids were scared by it, others grew numb to it. But for the people who were there when it happened, the pain remained sharp. The case wasn't just about two missing girls. It was about time slipping away, evidence fading, and a community carrying a question it could never answer. It reminded everyone that some wounds don't heal on their own. They linger quietly until someone finally finds the courage or the clue to reopen them. In the years that followed the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez, investigators worked tirelessly to find answers. At first, the search was intense. Dozens of officers, volunteers, and community members spent days combing through woods, riversides, abandoned structures, and mine entrances. But when the initial leads went cold, the investigation slowly shifted from an urgent search to a long, difficult puzzle. By 1979, 5 years after the twins vanished, Pike County had a new sheriff, Raymond Tucker. He was determined to solve the case that haunted the town. Tucker had grown up in Pike County and remembered the panic that swept through the community that night in 1974. Taking office, He made it clear that the Martinez case would not be forgotten under his leadership. One of his first actions was to bring fresh eyes to the investigation. He reviewed every old police report, re-interviewed witnesses, and reopened boxes of evidence that had been stored away. Back then, the methods were limited. There were no computers to organize information, and everything relied on handwritten notes, photographs, and the memories of people involved. Many of those memories had faded over time. During that renewed push, investigators identified a person of interest, a carnival worker who had been passing through town around the time the girls disappeared. He had a history of violence and had previously been involved in suspicious incidents in other states. For a brief moment, it felt like a real breakthrough. Detectives traveled to interview people who had worked with him, gathering records and piecing together his movements. Unfortunately, before they could question him directly, the man died in prison on unrelated charges. His death left a hole in the investigation. There were hints that he might have been in the area the night the twins vanished, but no solid evidence to confirm his involvement. Without him alive to question, the lead faded away, leaving investigators frustrated and the community disappointed. In the 1980s, the FBI got involved, offering profiling techniques that were new at the time. Their behavioral experts studied the details of the case, the twins' routines, the location where they were last seen, and the geography of Pike County. Their profile suggested that the crime was likely committed by someone familiar with the area, someone who had specifically targeted the twins rather than acting randomly. This shifted the focus of the investigation inward, toward local residents rather than strangers passing through. Detectives began quietly revisiting people who had lived in the area back then, asking new questions and trying to catch any inconsistencies. Rumors began to spread as people noticed the renewed police presence. Some neighbors became defensive, others grew uneasy, but still no clear suspect emerged. Meanwhile, the Martinez family lived in a painful routine. Every time the police knocked on their door with new information, hope would surge through their hearts, only to be crushed again when nothing came of it. Maria Martinez, their mother, often said that the hardest part wasn't knowing whether the girls were alive or gone. It was the constant rise and fall of hope. By 1994, technology had started to change. DNA analysis was becoming more common in criminal investigations. For many cold cases across the country, DNA testing brought new life and unexpected breakthroughs. Pike County authorities decided to re-examine the physical evidence collected back in 1974, hoping that science might succeed where human memory had failed. But the reality was devastating. Most of the evidence had not been stored with modern forensic methods in mind. Boxes had sat for years in damp storage rooms, and some items were degraded beyond use. Important samples that could have carried genetic material were either contaminated or too deteriorated to produce results. Detectives who had waited years for this moment described the feeling as heartbreaking. For the Martinez family, this was another heavy blow. DNA technology had solved so many mysteries across the country, yet their daughter's case seemed to be slipping through their fingers once again. By the end of the 1990s, the investigation was still open, but it was drifting further from answers. Many of the original officers had retired or passed away. Witnesses had aged and memories had grown cloudy. It seemed as if the truth was buried under layers of time, waiting for the right moment or the right person to uncover it. As the new millennium approached, the Martinez case had grown cold. Many of the original investigators had retired, some had passed away, and others had moved on to different roles. But the case file remained, sitting in storage rooms, thick, weathered, and heavy with unanswered questions. Inside were yellowing reports, faded photographs, hand-drawn maps, and boxes of evidence collected decades earlier. Each item told a small part of the story, but none revealed the full truth. In 2002, the Pike County Sheriff's Office formed a small cold case unit. It was made up of a few dedicated officers and forensic specialists who believed that modern technology could breathe new life into old investigations. The Martinez case was one of the first files they pulled out. For weeks they sat in cramped rooms surrounded by stacks of dusty folders, carefully scanning every page into a digital database. They hoped that organizing everything with modern tools would help them see patterns that might have been missed years before. They studied old witness statements line by line. Some details stood out differently with the passage of time. A neighbor's vague memory suddenly seemed more important. A timeline that once felt clear now appeared to have unexplored gaps. Investigators began to build digital maps of the area as it had looked in 1974, overlaying old mining records, road maps, and property lines to see if any forgotten areas might hold clues. This renewed effort gave the Martinez family a small flicker of hope. Robert and Maria, now older and more fragile, attended every public update, sitting quietly in the back of the room. They had learned not to get their hopes too high, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, technology would finally uncover what human investigation had not. Then, in 2008, something unexpected happened. Construction workers digging near the edge of town uncovered human remains buried deep in the ground. The site was quickly sealed off, and investigators rushed to the scene. News spread rapidly through Pike County. Many believed the mystery of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez was finally about to be solved. For days, reporters camped outside the sheriff's office. Old neighbors began sharing their memories again, and people who hadn't spoken about the case in years called in with theories. But the discovery ended in heartbreak. Forensic examination showed the bones were centuries old, likely belonging to early settlers or Native Americans who had lived in the area long before the twins were born. Once again, the investigation was pulled from a moment of hope back into silence. By the 2010s, the case had taken on a different kind of life. It became part of local legend. Teenagers told ghost stories about the twins near campfires. Some claimed to see their figures near the abandoned mine entrances late at night. For the younger generation, who hadn't lived through the fear of 1974, the story became more myth than memory. But for the Martinez family and the older residents of Pike County, there was nothing mythical about it. It was a wound that had never healed. Maria Martinez grew weaker with each passing year, still keeping the twins' room exactly as it had been. She would often sit quietly on the edge of one of the beds, running her hand over the quilts she had sewn herself, whispering their names like a prayer. The investigators in the cold case unit tried everything they could. They reached out to retired officers for interviews, hoping that something forgotten might surface. Some old detectives remembered tiny details: a strange truck, a suspicious man near the diner, a sound in the woods, but these were fragments, not answers. Witnesses who had been young adults at the time were now elderly, and their memories were fragile. Technology helped piece together the puzzle, but it couldn't restore lost evidence. Many items from the 1970s had been mishandled or degraded over time. Leads that could have been powerful decades earlier were now dead ends. As years passed, the case became a kind of quiet presence in the sheriff's office. New deputies would walk by the old file cabinet, see the name Martinez written on the spine of the box, and feel the weight of history. Some would ask questions. Others would promise themselves that one day they'd be the ones to solve it. But solving a mystery after so many decades is like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Every clue seems to slip away just as you get close. Despite everything, the file was never closed. It sat waiting, like the town itself, still carrying the question of what happened on that October night in 1974. October 12th, 2019 began like any other quiet autumn day in Pike County. The air was cool, the trees were beginning to turn shades of orange and red, and the abandoned Blackwood mine stood silent as it had for decades. Few people went near it anymore. The mine had long been sealed off in most areas, its tunnels unstable and dangerous. Over the years, it had become a place teenagers sometimes dared each other to visit but was otherwise left alone, a forgotten corner of the town. That afternoon, a call came into the sheriff's office. A property owner reported signs of trespassing near one of the old entrances to the Blackwood mine. Deputy Marcus Tanner was dispatched to check it out. Tanner was in his late 20s, too young to have been alive when the Martinez twins disappeared. He had heard the story growing up, like everyone else. But to him it was more of a haunting local legend than a case he expected to become part of. When Tanner arrived at the site, he noticed fresh footprints in the soft dirt near the mine's edge and a section of fencing that had been open. The cool air inside the entrance carried a faint, musty smell of earth and rust. He radioed his location, switched on his flashlight, and stepped cautiously into the darkness. Deeper inside, he found something that immediately caught his attention: a section of the tunnel that looked different. Over the decades, various parts of the mine had been closed off using large timbers and piles of rock, but one particular barrier looked less like an official closure and more like it had been built by hand, carefully arranged to blend in with the rest. It wasn't marked on any of the maps Tanner had studied. His curiosity grew. He tapped some of the wood with his flashlight and noticed that the barrier wasn't as solid as it appeared. After calling for backup, he and two other deputies slowly removed the rocks and beams. Behind the barrier lay a narrow passage leading deeper into a part of the mine that had supposedly been sealed off since the mid-1970s. As they moved through the tight space, Their flashlights illuminated something that made everyone stop in their tracks. On the ground were the remains of two individuals. They were side by side, partially covered by soil and debris that had settled over the years. Nearby, a few small personal items lay scattered. Among them was a silver heart-shaped locket engraved with the initials SM. Tanner didn't need to be told what those letters meant. SAM stood for Sarah Martinez. The realization hit him like a wave. After 45 years, the twins had finally been found. The area was immediately secured. Forensic teams were called in along with state investigators. They treated the site like a time capsule, carefully photographing, collecting, and preserving every piece of evidence. Even though decades had passed, the underground environment had preserved more than anyone expected. The twins' diner uniforms were still identifiable, their shoes mostly intact, and several personal objects had survived the years. Forensic examination revealed heartbreaking details. Both girls had died from blunt force trauma to the back of the head, indicating they had been attacked from behind. The careful arrangement of their bodies suggested that the killer had known them. It wasn't a random act of violence. The location itself told another story. This section of the mine had been officially sealed only months before their disappearance. Only someone who knew the tunnels well would have been aware that this area was still accessible at the time. The news spread through Pike County like wildfire. For decades, people had wondered if the twins were alive somewhere, kidnapped or buried in some unknown place. Now the truth was partially revealed. Crowds gathered near the sheriff's office. Reporters returned. Neighbors who had long stopped talking about the case began to share their memories once more. For the Martinez family, the discovery was both devastating and a strange kind of relief. After 45 years of endless waiting, the girls had finally been found. Robert and Maria Martinez, now elderly and fragile, received the news surrounded by family. There were tears, long silences, and a shared understanding that their journey for answers had entered a new chapter. The mine discovery marked the turning point. What had once been a fading mystery suddenly became an active investigation again. Evidence that had been hidden for nearly half a century was now in the hands of modern forensic experts. And for the first time in decades, investigators had a real chance to find out not just where the girls had been, but who had taken their lives. The discovery inside the Blackwood mine changed everything. After decades of uncertainty, investigators finally had real evidence in their hands, not just memories, rumors, or fading leads. For the first time in 45 years, there was a path forward. Modern forensic experts carefully examined the remains, clothing, and surrounding area. What they found would unravel a mystery that had haunted Pike County for nearly half a century. One of the first breakthroughs came from something as simple as dirt. Forensic teams collected soil samples from around where the twins had been found. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of a particular industrial lubricant mixed into the soil. This wasn't ordinary grease or oil. It was a specialized compound that had been used exclusively by Blackwell Mining Company during the 1970s to maintain their heavy machinery. This detail was crucial. It narrowed the possible suspects to people who had worked for or had special access to Blackwell Mining at the time of the twins' disappearance. Investigators pulled out old employment records from 1974, cross-checking names with people who lived near the Martinez family and the diner where the twins worked. Among those names, one stood out clearly: Howard Keller, a maintenance supervisor who had worked for the company during that exact period. Keller was not an unfamiliar name. Back in the 1970s, he had been briefly questioned because he often visited the diner where Sarah and Rebecca worked. However, he had provided an alibi supported by his wife, Elaine, and nothing directly tied him to the crime. As a result, he had slipped off the suspect list and lived a quiet, seemingly ordinary life in Pike County ever since. But now, decades later, new details were starting to emerge. Detectives interviewed former Blackwell employees, many of whom were retired and in their 70s or 80s. Several remembered Keller as a controlling and intimidating figure. A few former diner employees even recalled how he often lingered around the diner after his shifts, making Sarah uncomfortable with his unwanted attention. At the time, no one imagined that this behavior could lead to something so tragic. The biggest turning point came when investigators located Elaine Keller, Howard's now widowed wife. She was elderly, frail, and living in a nursing home. When detectives spoke to her, they were gentle but direct. To their surprise, Elaine broke down and confessed that she had lied about her husband's alibi all those years ago. She explained that she had lived in fear of him for decades. He had been abusive, both physically and emotionally, and she had felt trapped in their marriage. On the night the twins disappeared, Keller was not at home as he had claimed. Elaine had lied to protect herself and their children, afraid of what he might do if she told the truth. Her journals, which she kept hidden for years, detailed his violent outbursts and his strange obsession with Sarah Martinez. This confession opened the floodgates. With a warrant, investigators searched Keller's property. Even though he was now 80 years old, he still lived in Pike County, in the same house he had occupied during the 1970s. In his basement and garage, forensic teams uncovered a chilling collection of old belongings. They found Sarah's locket, the same design as the one recovered in the mine, with traces of her blood still inside. They found Rebecca's hair ribbon, carefully folded into a small box. Even more damning, they discovered a stolen mining logbook from 1974. It contained hand-drawn calculations showing how Keller could access the supposedly sealed section of the mine where the twins' remains were eventually found. The final piece of evidence came from Keller's old pickup truck, which had been stored in a shed behind his house. Forensic experts dismantled parts of the interior and found traces of blood beneath the passenger seat frame. Modern DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to the Martinez twins. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of unanswered questions suddenly began to align. The dirt, the logbook, the personal items, the confession, each piece formed part of a clear and devastating picture. On October 25, 2019, officers arrived quietly at Keller's home to arrest him. The community watched in shock as the frail-looking man who had attended church, volunteered in town, and lived among them for decades, was led away in handcuffs. For many, it was unthinkable that the man they had greeted in grocery stores and waved to at church picnics was the same person who had taken 2 young lives so long ago. For the Martinez family, the moment was overwhelming. They had waited nearly their entire lives for this day. Tears flowed freely as they realized that after 45 years, the truth was finally coming out. The investigation's breakthrough was not just about science or evidence. It was about persistence, truth, and the courage of those who finally spoke up. Decades of silence had been broken. The arrest of Howard Keller sent shockwaves through Pike County. For decades, people had whispered theories, blamed strangers, and filled the silence with guesses. But now, the truth had a face, and it was the face of someone they had known all along. The quiet old man with the slow shuffle and polite smile was the same man who had committed one of the county's darkest crimes. The legal process began almost immediately. Because Keller was 80 years old and in fragile health, many doubted he would ever stand trial. But the Martinez family, along with investigators who had carried this case through generations, were determined to see justice served, no matter how much time had passed. District Attorney Linda Moore, who had grown up hearing about the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca, led the prosecution. For her, it was not just another case. It was a chance to give a voice to 2 young girls who had been silenced nearly half a century ago. She assembled a team of forensic experts, historians, and retired detectives who had worked on the original investigation. Every document, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement was carefully reviewed to build the strongest case possible. The courtroom was packed on the day of the preliminary hearing. People who had been teenagers when the twins vanished now sat with gray hair and walking sticks, watching the man accused of the crime finally face the law. The Martinez family occupied the front row, their faces showing a mix of sorrow, relief, and quiet strength. When Keller was brought into the courtroom, he looked frail and hunched, but his presence carried a weight that made the room go silent. The charges were read aloud: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. For the first time, the horrific details of what had happened inside that mine were presented publicly. The evidence spoke louder than any rumor ever could. Elaine Keller's taped confession played for the court, her trembling voice describing the night Keller returned home late, covered in dirt and smelling like oil. The forensic experts testified about the soil samples, the DNA from the truck, and the personal items found in his basement. Retired employees recalled his behavior around the twins. One by one, the puzzle pieces fit together in front of everyone's eyes. Keller's defense tried to argue that his memory was failing, that the evidence was too old, that time had blurred the truth. But the facts were unshakable. The jury listened carefully as the story unfolded, not as a cold timeline, but as a haunting human tragedy that had scarred a community for generations. Midway through the trial, Keller's health began to decline. Some feared he might pass away before a verdict could be reached. But on May 12, 2020, after weeks of emotional testimony, the jury delivered its decision: guilty on all charges. Keller showed little reaction as the words were read. The courtroom, however, erupted in quiet cries and sighs of relief. Many embraced, some simply closed their eyes and whispered prayers. For the Martinez family, the moment was both heartbreaking and healing. Sarah and Rebecca's mother, now in her late 80s, held a framed photo of her daughters and whispered, "We never gave up." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she thanked the prosecutors, detectives, and community members who had carried the case for so long. The judge sentenced Keller to life in prison without the possibility of parole, even though it was unlikely he would live many more years. But for the family and the town, the sentence was about more than punishment. It was about finally acknowledging the truth, no matter how late it came. In the weeks after the trial, Pike County held a memorial ceremony at the town square. A new plaque was placed beneath the old oak tree, engraved with the words, "In memory of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez, lost but never forgotten. Justice, at last." People lit candles, shared stories, and stood side by side. Neighbors, friends, and strangers united by a shared pain and a shared sense of closure. The case had haunted their lives for 45 years, but now the silence had been broken, and the wound had begun to heal. Though justice came late, it came with the power to bring peace to the Martinez family and the entire community. It reminded everyone that truth does not disappear with time, it waits to be found. For 45 years, the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez haunted Pike County like a story with no final chapter. But in the end, truth found its way to the surface through the persistence of investigators, the courage of witnesses, and the unshakable love of a family that refused to forget. Their story is a reminder that justice may take time, but it never truly disappears. Call to action. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video to keep their memory alive and subscribe for more real stories where the past finally meets justice. And remember, even the quietest cases can speak volumes when someone is willing to listen.